In this video, I'm going to show you a very interesting game of the only one, Hans Niemann. Playing with the white pieces against the living legend from Ukraine, Vasyl Ivanchuk, who has been at the top for so many years. He has been a grandmaster even before Hans was born. So that's a very interesting clash of generations, even of playing styles. And we get to see the very best of Hans in this game. So let's dive straight into the action. Make sure to subscribe to this channel if you're interested to learn more about Hans and other top players and different strategies of how to put your opponent under pressure. Let's look how Hans is doing that. He played the move 1e4, e5, knight f3, knight f6. It's the Petrov defense. And with Vasyl Ivanchuk, you never know what he's going to play. He has a lot of different openings, but by going for this Petrov line, he wants to play very solid against the very ambitious Hans Niemann. Knight takes pawn, black plays d6, knight f3 back, and white has to give back the pawn on e4. So d4, d5, bishop d3, knight c6. One of the many different available moves for black in this position. And for quite some more moves, we are actually following modern theory. So white castled, bishop e7, black continues developing. So after knight bd2, white is threatening to take the knight on e4. So black takes first, knight takes d2, bishop takes d2, and the bishop comes to g4 to pin the knight, threatening to take the pawn on d4. So black will try to win the pawn, but white obviously play the move c3 to protect the pawn, castling kingside, and now white is questioning this bishop on g4. There's an annoying bishop, you want to get rid of it, so the bishop goes back. But playing a move like g4 is a little bit too radical. You don't want to weaken your king's position. You cannot take pawn moves back after all. So white has a different idea. Very remarkable idea, but worth keeping in mind. So he goes for the move g3. This looks strange, but after queen d7, black attacks the pawn on h3 and connect the rooks with each other. There's this idea of playing the move king to g2. So the king even supports this this knight on f3, hoping that at some point white can just move the queen away. But, well, that's for later. Black also wants to get rid of this very strong bishop on d3 and played here the move bishop g6. This is still well-known theory, and in general, training of light squared bishops is not bad for black. After the move bishop f4, bishop takes d3, queen takes d3. Technically speaking, you can say that white's bishop is worse than the bishop on e7 because of the pawns being placed on the same color as the dark squared bishop. But I don't think it's a big problem here because the bishop is doing pretty well. It's putting a bit of pressure against the pawn on c7, and black thinks, well, that's not what I want to face for a longer period of time. And Ivanchuk goes for bishop d6, offering the exchange of bishops, but Hans has a different idea. He played here the move knight g5. And that's serious because the bishop cannot be taken. If you do so, it will be queen takes h7 with checkmate. So the mating threat needs to be stopped here first. g6 played, and only now the move bishop takes d6, queen takes d6. It looks like not much is happening here, guys. It's a symmetrical position. All the bishops have been exchanged. White puts the rook on the open file, and the same does black. So it's a symmetrical position. Pieces have been swapped already, but Hans is probably quite happy with this position. And let me try to explain why. Because I think white is a bit more active with ideas of putting pressure on the king side. And the first move Hans played here is h4. So the idea is to bring up the h-pawn to impose new threats on the king side. Let's see how that's gonna work out here. Also a problem for black is this knight on c6. It's really out of play, and that is thanks to the pawn on c3. It's protecting the pawn on d4, and the knight is not doing that well on c6. There are some options. For instance, if you would kick the knight out with h6, I think black has to reckon with a move like knight h3. When the knight can come to f4, there's a good spot for the knight so that it will attack the pawn on d5. Maybe queen b5 can be played as well. There are also ideas of putting pressure on that king side with a move like h5. There is still a lot of play in this position. That's what I want to show you with this line. Instead of playing the move h6, Ivanchuk went for the move knight e8. This looks strange at first, but the idea is very clear. He wants to bring the knight to e6. So white played the move h5. Of course, this pawn cannot be taken because of queen takes h7 with checkmate once again. So there followed knight to e6. Does white want to exchange knights? No, because if you go for the exchange of knights, you're helping black to take back with the rook, then the other rook can come over to the e-file, and then we will get to see a really boring game. So Hans keeps the tension high. Played here the move knight to f3. I think that's a good move, and the knight has different ideas, including with the idea of coming to e5 anytime soon. So black played here the move c6. So that's very logical to make a useful waiting move to reinforce this pawn chain. Pawn on d5 is well defended now, but we get to see another idea of white's play, and that's the move rook h1. Now, white brings the rook to the h-file with very clear ideas of opening that file, double the rooks there, and launch an attack against the black king. So how should black cope with that pressure? Well, Ivanchuk played here the absolute radical move, g5. He was afraid for the opening of the h-file so that the white rook would join play. But let me show you what happened if you play a move like knight g7 so that you may offer the exchange of rooks. You could initiate these exchanges. You're also pressurizing the pawn on h5. In that case, there will follow h takes g6. If you do take back with the h-pawn, white is first going to put a knight on e5. And this is a brilliant move. And it's incredibly strong because the e-file is closed. There's no chance here to trade off rooks on the e-file any longer. And white is planning to put rooks on the h-file and try to deliver checkmate on h8. So taking back with the h-pawn is really bad. If you do take back with the f-pawn, it will be even nicer for white to install that knight in the center on e5. This knight cannot be dislodged by a black pawn. It's standing there, has a big impact on the black pieces. They cannot move that easily, and white can try to make progress on the king side by doubling the rooks, maybe on the h-file, maybe on the e-file. Various ideas are possible here, but white is pressing. Back to the game, you understand now why Ivanchuk played the move g5, but it's a very ugly move and it leads to new weaknesses on the king side. White played first knight e5. The knight is doing well there. Black goes for the move h6. That was the idea of playing g5 to support the pawn, and now the queen comes into f5. Here we see the pawn is no longer on g6, so this square becomes available to the white queen, and the queen has different ideas. One of the main threats here is actually to play a move like knight g4 to attack the pawn on h6, and if you get more time, then you will probably just play a move like queen f6 to hit the pawn another time. Black's king side is just falling apart, so knight g7 was played, so the knight attacks the queen, and the queen, you would expect the queen to go backwards, but now Hans stands up. He was playing for a kingside attack, but sometimes you have to transform your advantages, and now he put a queen on d7. He's offering the exchange of queens, and that's a remarkable idea. But black, what can black do? That's not that simple, because also the pawn on b7 and maybe later the pawn on a7 can just drop. So queen takes d7, knight takes d7 played, hitting this rook on f8. The rook cannot go anywhere, so the only move is rook takes e1. And this is a very important moment. What are you going to play? The automatic move, rook takes e1, is not too great because there is rook d8 and the rook will kick the knight out. And well, it's not easy to make further progress. But here, Hans Niemann played a very clever in-between move, the intermediate check, knight f6, forcing the king to go into the corner. Is the only move, and only now you take back on e1. Maybe this was underestimated by Ivanchuk because he may have felt relieved that now this knight is on f6. It's no longer attacking the rook on f8, and black can even close the e-file. Look, this looks like a very boring position, right? Only rook and knight, but the game goes on. Rook e5, that's a fantastic idea. Black cannot do that much. Played here the move a5, and now the move knight g4 was played, attacking the pawn on h6. What should black do? Well, there followed the move king h7. I was thinking king g7 is more logical to keep the pawn protected and place the king closer to the center. But then there is knight e3. And after something like king f6, you put his knight on f5, hitting the pawn on h6. Here we see that launching the h-pawn by white is not only with an attacking purpose, but it's also fixing that backward pawn on the h-file for black. If you play rook h8, there is knight d6, and white step by step will penetrate into black's position with a move like knight d6. You're hitting the pawn, rook f5 will come with check, after which the pawn on f7 is likely to fall. This is fantastic, aggressive play in the endgame. But now you understand why the king didn't go to g7, but instead king h7 was played. Now the rook comes to f5, and after king to g7, now anyway, there follow the move rook f6. You see the pawn is under attack, and there's no convenient way to defend the pawn. Only rook h8 can be played here. But you see that black is running out of useful moves. There follow this move, a4. Black needs to keep the pawn on h6 defended. There are not that many good moves. If the knight goes away, probably the rook will come to d6 and maybe later to d7. If the rook comes in, it's clear that black needs to be concerned about the safety of its pawns on the queen side. There follow the move b6. Very logical move, but leading to other weaknesses. And Hans has a new plan to put more pressure, playing the very energetic move f4. With the idea that after g takes f4, g takes f4, the pawn will come to f5, attacking this knight on e6, and the knight will have to move, after which the pawns can be attacked on the 6th rank. This is very, very impressive play by Hans. So what should black do? Well, black may play a move like b5. It's relatively the best move, but I think after f5, white has a huge initiative. If you play knight f4, it's king f3, black can take the pawn, but there's also rook takes c6. And I think the remaining pawns, they are vulnerable, plus there are attacking chances for white against the pawn on f7. Maybe f6 can be played at some point. So white is combining threats on the queen side with pressure against the black king. Well, this didn't happen. Instead of playing the move b5, looking for counterplay, Ivanchuk switched with his rook to c8 to defend the pawn here. And the idea is that if you now take the pawn on h6, there's knight takes f4. That's too early. You shouldn't do that. Instead, much better is playing f5 first to attack the knight on e6. And the knight has to choose. Where is it going? Well, if you do play knight f4 check, the king will come to f3, attacking the knight on f4. If now the knight captures the pawn on h5, there is rook takes h6, and the knight is in trouble. Well, if you move the rook somewhere, let's say going to h8, there are even ideas just to wrap up the pawns on the queen side. So therefore, knight g5 was played, but black's position is falling apart here. Rook takes h6, that's pawn number 1. Knight comes to e4, the knight looks active, but also now the king can be activated. King f3, excellent move. Rook c7, waiting move. King comes to f4. Very important to make sure that all your pieces are joining the game, especially in the endgame. The king will become a much more important piece, obviously. Knight went to d2, and the rook can now come to d6. The rook is active, and after the move knight c4, attacking the rook on d6, there is h6 with check. King goes to h7, and here the move rook d8. And now Ivanchuk resigned, because if you do take the pawn on b2, there follows this move, king to g5, protecting the pawn. And after black takes another pawn on a4, it's knight f6 with checkmate. Beautiful mating pattern. Knight is giving a check. The pawn and the rook are taking away the remaining squares from the black king. Very impressive line. One other line I wanted to show you is, for instance, if you don't take the pawn on b2, but let's say you want to go back to d2 with your knight, with the idea that if king g5, threatening knight f6 can still be met by knight e4 check, then white is of course still winning, he's much better, but the game goes on. Much more precise, instead of playing the move king g5, in my opinion, is to play the move rook b8. Now you see that white is combining once again play on the king side with attacking pawns on the other side of the board. And I think the second pawn will drop very soon, while if the knight will do something active, let's say it will come back to c4, there's always this idea of playing for checkmate against the black king. I thought this was one of the most impressive games of Hans Niemann lately, grinding a very interesting endgame against one of the living legends. Very nice technical performance. Maybe it's something you would not expect from the younger generation against these very experienced players. You would expect something very sharp, a lot of calculations, but here Hans just completely outplayed Ivanchuk on all different aspects of the game. Calculation, positional play, good opening preparation, and fantastic endgame technique.